In this lesson, we'll take a look at the role of sleep in memory function. There's growing evidence that sleep does enhance memory, and we'll take a look at how that is understood to occur. First, some background on sleep. The early research used a technique called the EEG, the electroencephalogram, and subjects would wear a set of scalp electrodes, and each of these little electrodes could record the electrical activity of the underlying cells in the cortex. So it's picking up the electrical activity, the action potentials, from populations of cells right underneath this location, so underneath the skull and on the surface of the cortex. And you get a whole bunch of electrodes along the scalp, and you can then generate a sort of a whole brain EEG. And when the person is awake, the EEG signal looks like this: low amplitude, high frequency signals. It's as though the populations of cells all over the brain at different cortical locations are communicating in complex ways, and the overall activity is recorded as this EEG signal here. But when the person goes off to sleep, the pattern, the EEG signal pattern, changes. And so different stages have been identified based on the characteristic waveforms at that stage of sleep. For example, down here in stage 4, the signal is very different from the waking signal. It's high amplitude, low frequency signals. It's as though the cortical populations of cells have been somehow synchronized in some kind of ways, so that populations are firing together and then silent together and then firing together, etc., all over the surface of the cortex. So a very different mode of electrical activity in the cortex during sleep as compared to waking. After about 60 or 70 minutes or so, the subject enters into their first REM episode. Now here the EEG pattern is similar to the waking pattern. And this is also the time at which, if you wake people up, they often report that they were dreaming. However, it has been found that dreams can occur in other stages of sleep, although the REM dreams tend to be longer, and they're the ones that we often, if we're awakened, will report vivid auditory and visual images. Now, on a typical night, a person will go through several of these cycles, right? So we could call this progression here from awake through these stages of sleep to REM, and then back to stage 1 and so on. That would be one cycle of sleeping. So it raises the question, why do brains do this? Why do we lose consciousness, and what's the significance of this change in the mode of processing during sleep? Well, researchers suspect that sleep is performing something valuable because it is widespread in the animal kingdom. And a particular characteristic that is widespread suggests that it is an adaptation. It was serving some important function, and it has been retained through the evolution of animals. So many animals sleep, and so that alone suggests that it is serving some kind of function. Secondly, I mean, just think about the idea of losing consciousness. That's a significant threat to one's survival, right? So if you're an animal out there in the world, this prolonged period of unconsciousness increases the threat of predation or other environmental threats. So again, the fact that there's such a high cost to sleep suggests it has an adaptive function. And finally, down here, you take a look at this is sleep in marine mammals like dolphins. If you record activity over the right and the left hemispheres, interestingly, they seem to sleep one hemisphere at a time. So while the right hemisphere here is in what we would kind of call the stage 4 sleep, high amplitude, low frequency sleep, the left hemisphere is in a different mode of processing, right? And then sometime later, it switches. It's as though the marine mammals have evolved a way to maintain sleep all the while living in an aquatic environment, in which requires that they surface to get oxygen. If the entire brain were asleep, that would pose a challenge. So the marine mammals seem to have evolved a way to preserve this sleep pattern in a way that they can survive in an aquatic environment. Again, it suggests that if evolution goes to such lengths to preserve sleep, sleep must be having some kind of function. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we might understand the role of sleep in memory function. First, we'll start with the waking brain. So here we have a look at our left hemisphere, and we also have put up here the EEG pattern. Recall it's low amplitude, high frequency. And the idea here is that that signal is the result of complex communications between populations of cells, locally, and then more long-distance communications with other regions of the brain. And so during the waking state, there's lots of complex processing going on by our cortical cells, and that shows up as the EEG pattern here. Now, we've already learned that when we're awake and experiencing events in our lives, the hippocampus is a site of convergence for auditory information, visual information, what we're feeling, etc. And as a consequence, the hippocampus then is going to make synaptic changes here that encode, that represent the events of our lives. And we're going to show that here with these red synapses here. And they're shown to be large. The idea is that lots of LTP has happened here at these synapses. So the synapses previously were weaker, but because of some experience, they're now much stronger. So LTP has happened here. Now, especially if an event is an emotional event, the amygdala, a hub of our emotional brain, can signal the hippocampus to make sure to sort of consolidate that event as an important event. And so we'll just say that throughout the day, some events are sort of more significant, more important, and that will be reflected in the strength of the synapses in the hippocampus. Now, there are lots of other things that happen during the day, and we'll indicate those events with the little green synapses here, and they might undergo some weak LTP as we go through the day, just incidental events. So some synaptic strengthening will happen at a different pattern of synapses, but not to the degree of the important events of our day. So notice, though, that a particular event has a pattern of synaptic changes that represents that event. Other events would have a different pattern of synaptic changes, and important events, the synaptic changes are greater than the less important events. Okay, so now let's take a look at what's going on during slow wave sleep. And let's first focus on the hippocampus, where we just left off, and we'll come back to the cortical EEG signal in a moment. So during slow wave sleep, researchers argue that what happens is that the hippocampus now is going to be signaling the cortex to store the memories that were encoded during the day. So again, remember our red synapses here were strengthened because of some important event. During slow wave sleep, while we're unconscious, those same patterns of hippocampal cells are going to now be relaying electrical signals up to cortical cells. LTP will happen in these cortical cells in such a way that the memory is going to, in a sense, move from the hippocampal system to the cortical system. And we call this system consolidation because the memory is being transferred from the hippocampal system to the cortical system. In contrast, synaptic consolidation would be just wherever LTP is happening. That could be at the cortex or in the hippocampus. So again, the idea is that during sleep, we replay those patterns of activity that represent important memories of the day. And so there are physical signals being sent up there, action potentials being sent up to the cortex in such a way that LTP up here can establish a cortical memory. Now, what's the evidence for this replay? Evidence comes in the form of rodent experiments and other types of experiments where they will allow a rat to explore a maze, for example, while recording from different hippocampal cells simultaneously. So let's say the rat is running down this leg of the maze. Well, there is a particular hippocampal cell will show high activity. When it gets to a different location in the maze, a different hippocampal cell will show activity. When it proceeds further along, yet another hippocampal cell shows high activity. And so, in other words, as the rat explores the maze, there's a certain pattern of hippocampal cell activity during the waking stage, during learning of the maze. Well, during sleep, researchers found that those same hippocampal cells fired in the same pattern during slow wave sleep. And the hippocampus is in communication with the cortex during this stage of sleep. And so the suggestion is that the brain is replaying those memories in an effort to move the memory up to cortical locations for long-term storage. So this would be a newly consolidated memory here. It has undergone one round of system consolidation during sleep. Now, there's something else interesting going on during slow wave sleep, and that is the EEG pattern is very different from the waking pattern. So you'll notice up here we have the high amplitude, low frequency EEG signal. That is very different from the waking signal. And scientists think what's going on here is that brainstem neurons, brainstem systems we'll call them, are sending signals up to the cortex in a way that synchronizes cortical activity. So local populations of cells show a burst of electrical activity, then they remain quiet, then they show a burst of activity, then they remain quiet, right? So if we're looking at this population, let's say that this record here represents the activity of that population of cells. We have lots of action potentials in this population, and then they remain quiet for a while, and then lots of action potentials quiet. So the brainstem is sort of imposing a synchrony on different populations of cortical cells. It's happening over here at different locations as well. And the idea then is that this synchronization of cortical cells impairs communication between regions of the brain. So let's say that these cells here at time 1 are firing action potentials. Well, some of those signals are going to travel down long axons to a different region of the cortex, right? But down here, in the time it takes those signals to travel there, down here, this population is in its quiet phase, right? So when these signals arise, they cannot normally respond. Normally, they would be responding, and that's that complicated talking that goes on during the waking stage. But during slow wave sleep, the idea is that this synchrony that's imposed by the brainstem prohibits, interferes with long-range communication between brain areas. Notice that's correlated with unconsciousness, and we'll see that researchers now suspect that for a brain to be conscious, if our brain is conscious, it requires certain kinds of neural communication. And during sleep, that neural communication is interfered with because of this synchronization due to brainstem activity. And finally, now the connection between what's going on in the cortex and what's going on in the hippocampus here. After all, we said the hippocampus is talking to the cortex. It seems that the hippocampal firing here coincides with the peak activity of cortical neurons, right? So it's almost as if we have the optimal conditions for LTP in the cortex. These cells in the hippocampus are firing high frequency bursts of action potentials up to the cortex, and you'll get a lot of activity in these cortical cells, and that corresponds to the peak activity as recorded in the EEG. Okay, so now we're going to see what happens in REM sleep. So recall, we started with the waking brain, then we went to slow wave sleep where system consolidation was happening. The hippocampus was talking to the cortex in a way to transfer the memory up to the cortex. Now in REM sleep, something different appears to be happening. If we take a look down at our hippocampus, we're indicating here that the hippocampus does not seem to be in communication with the cortex here. So this is not a sleep state where system consolidation would be happening. Rather, what seems to be going on here is, again, the brainstem signals are being sent up to the cortex, and they're considered to be sort of random signals to the cortex. And the function of those random signals, as far as memory goes, seems to be to do molecular consolidation, right, at local synapses up in the cortex. And the idea then is that, recall that during slow wave sleep, new memories were consolidated up in the cortex. During REM sleep, the idea is that those new memories, recently learned things, are going to be integrated with related memories. Right, so memories already stored up in the cortex. So if some event happened that involved a particular person that you know, okay, so here comes some new event, but now that memory can be integrated with other memories involving that person, or that place, or that topic, or whatever, right? So during REM sleep, the suggestion is that new memories get integrated into the long-term memory system. It's not system consolidation here because the hippocampus is not in communication with the cortex during REM sleep, but it's rather these brainstem signals are setting up a situation where new memories can be integrated with older memories. Now, recall that we often have dreams during this period, and vivid dreams, and the idea is these random signals sent up to the visual cortex and auditory cortex are generating our dream imagery, right? In addition, the amygdala shows high activity in this stage of sleep, giving it a highly emotional tone to those dreams. And furthermore, there's reduced frontal cortex activity. And this is thought to be related to this idea of having sort of control or agency in a dream. We often don't, right? However, lucid dreamers show increased frontal cortex activity during REM sleep. And that may be correlated to their reports that they have more control over the dreaming process. Now, it's in REM sleep here where we're going to introduce this counterintuitive idea called the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis. And it's a counterintuitive claim about the role of sleep in memory because normally we think of memory as involving the strengthening of synapses. Well, Tononi and his research team will argue that what happens during sleep, however, is a widespread weakening of synapses. And counterintuitively, he's going to argue this is going to help memories be stored and maintained, help the brain be a learning device as a result of this generalized weakening of synapses. So let's return to our situation with the red and the green synapses. Recall that the red synapses encoded some important event and the green ones less important event. Tononi's going to argue that during sleep, all synapses will be weakened to some extent. And if not, if a synapse was only marginally strengthened, then it will weaken back to some baseline level of strength. And he argues this is important because if you're going to have a brain that is responsive to the world by strengthening synapses, you have to have a way of weakening them again so they can be prepared to learn again the next day. Why is that? Because from a theoretical point of view, there is some maximum amount of strengthening that can happen at synapses. I mean, let's imagine during the course of a day, all of your hippocampal synapses got maximally strengthened. Well, then the hippocampus would be unable to learn anything new because remember, learning requires that synapses increase in strength. So the idea is because there is some sort of theoretical limit to the amount of synaptic strengthening that can happen, you're going to need to have a system or a stage where you weaken the synapses again so they can be ready to learn again the next day. And Tononi argues that sleep is precisely this stage. So he'll say that sleep is the price we pay for plasticity when awake. If we're going to have a brain that can respond to the world by increasing synapse strengths, we can't do that forever. And so we can't keep on strengthening synapses to an infinite degree. So you're going to have a stage where you weaken them again so the brain can be prepared for new learning. By the way, that gives us a reason why you're going to want to do system consolidation. You're going to want to move those memories out of the hippocampus so the hippocampus, in a sense, can be reset and ready to learn on another day. Now, where does the synaptic weakening happen? Well, Tononi would argue not only in the hippocampus, but also in the cortex. For those synapses that strengthened incidentally, they'll be weakened. And what remains are those synapses that encode important events, right? And so it's a kind of a selection process, sort of a Darwinian selection. He calls it down selection. That synapses will be weakened, but those synapses that were really strong will survive the weakening process, and that might allow them to undergo system consolidation on subsequent nights. Because there is evidence that for some autobiographical memories, it takes days, weeks, months, sometimes years for the full system consolidation to happen.